Everybody, just wanted to give you a quick intro before this video kicks off. We had a few technical difficulties getting this recording this month, so there's a bit of an audio issue for the first 10 minutes. Well, to be honest, there's no audio at all for the first 10 minutes. So if you want to watch the slides for 10 minutes, it's really kind of an introduction to Xamarin and why Xamarin is awesome, which you should know Xamarin is awesome. And then, like I said, about 10 minutes in, the audio fixes up and you're good to go for the rest of the presentation. I hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you next time. Dotnet Users Group.
kind of gives us that. But there's a good number of customers that prefer a more consistent look. For one thing, it can simplify training and kind of lower training costs. And I think their designers sometimes prefer just doing one set of UI specs instead of two. So that's becoming kind of more and more of a thing for Xamarin to have, consistent UI. The consistent UI is the term that we use for when the Android and iOS UI look pretty much the same. And you can do that with visual and material. That's kind of our current preferred way to achieve consistent UI, and then more and more in the future can achieve more consistency with drawn UI, which I'll talk a little more about later in the talk. Okay, so that's kind of the Xamarin intro. So what's happened recently in Xamarin land? This is a slide with just a bunch of features that were added. So this slide is probably 5 months old, and then they were added in the last year. So I won't read through them, but there's a bunch of things in there. Let's see. So we also made some enhancements on the tooling side. So this is in Visual Studio 16.7, which was released, 2 months ago, maybe. So this is kind of our new getting started UI. And another thing that's new in this experience is that shell has kind of gotten promoted to be the default choice for creating new apps. So flyout and tabbed here both use Xamarin Shell or App Shell, which is kind of a easier to use, higher level container for your app and the navigation that goes along with it. Blank doesn't use Shell. It's just kind of a simple blank app, although there's a little bit of content in there. And then we have some shell updates in the default template, and this kind of fancy animated UI that lets you get started. So hopefully that improves the experience, especially for new users. But again, the shift to shell is probably the most interesting thing for folks who are familiar with Xamarin and use it. Let's see. So here's some other tooling enhancements that have come about in the last year or so. IntelliCode was XAML before, and now for Android XML. Multi-targeting support. So source link. When did we add that on Mac? I'm not sure exactly, but I do believe that source link support is there. It's there on VS Windows before, and should be on VS Mac in the latest version, 8.7. Some performance improvements over time. Startup tracing, which is the thing I mentioned before, where you can kind of get run this sort of profiler and then try to get the right trade-off between code size. So the more you compile ahead of time, the bigger the app is, but the faster it is. So startup tracing allows you to kind of evaluate and see what code path is used at startup time, and then ahead of time compile all of that so that you can speed up your app launch while not having the app grow too much in code size. And XAML hot reload and hot restart. So I've got another slide on hot restart. This is the only one on hot reload, but it's kind of a core experience in Xamarin. And we actually have two flavors of hot reload today. There's the kind of the existing default, which we call full page, and then there's the newer version, which is it's just in preview currently, which we call incremental. And the first kind of rereads the XAML file and updates the whole thing on the device when you save changes. The second, as you type, the incremental, as you type, it will go and send the changes over to the device and just update the individual control that you change. So it preserves more UI state. It also shares more code with WPF and UWP hot reload, and it enables use of our new live visual tree feature. But again, that's a preview feature, but just FYI on that existing if you wanted to check it out at all. But the kind of default full page is the thing probably to use for the most part still. And then hot restart. The name hot restart's a little confusing, but it sort of has two value props here. The first is being able to more quickly kind of deploy changes, but the second value prop and the more interesting one, and I think the one that resonates more with folks, is that hot restart for iOS lets you do most of your development for an iOS app without needing to have a Mac. You can do it all from Windows, and so you can't you can't sign the app, so you need a Mac for that, or perhaps use a cloud service like Mac and Cloud. And there's some restrictions on what APIs you can use, but for the most part, especially getting started, it kind of lets you do iOS development without having a Mac. So that's a nice feature. It works pretty well. This one's still in preview too. So, but if you want to develop for iOS from Windows, I'd certainly encourage you to kind of check it out and try it out, because it's a better way to do it. Let's see. Some other, so moving on to forms and some relatively recent additions in forms, the last few releases. So collection view, new shell, which I mentioned before, and then it's going to have some more changes in Forms 5.0, and then in Maui, even more shell updates, carousel view, new control, swipe view, another new control, expander, same. And also we have some better support for writing your UI in C# using this technology that's called C# for markup. So that uses this syntax here. So it's sort of a more concise way. You could always code your UI in C#, but with this support, it lets you use it more concise syntax and more kind of fluent style APIs. Like you can see button, when it sets all the properties on the button, it does so with these extension methods: style, fill, expand, margin, bind. The binding support, for folks who really prefer doing their UI in C#, it's these sort of syntax niceties are sort of a high value thing for them. So C# UI is kind of somewhat new in terms of being incorporated into forms. Though we're moving the support to the Xamarin Community Toolkit, and then in Maui kind of having really first class productized support for using this similar style of C# code to write your UI, if you should so choose. And so that's a good question. Not by default. However, Vincent, who a community member who kind of contributed to this UI, he's a big fan of LiveSharp. This is the third-party product. So if you use LiveSharp today, you can get hot reload with C# code. And so that's kind of what he and some other folks in the community like to use today. As far as first class from Microsoft support for C# hot reload, that's coming, but it's not there today. So that's kind of a bit of a future thing, but it's something that we're working on. So yeah, that is the status of that. All right. So then kind of moving on to Xamarin Forms 5, and I I should have included a slide on this, but I didn't. So in terms of version numbering, it's it's maybe a little confusing, but we just released Xamarin Forms 4.8, maybe a few how long? Maybe a month and a half or so ago. We're, we're we're skipping 4.9. And so Xamarin Forms 5 will be the next version and kind of the last version before Maui. So, and also along with Xamarin Forms 5, there's sort of this new emphasis on the Xamarin Community Toolkit, and to some degree breaking out some of the Xamarin stuff to put in this this community toolkit, and not so some of the things that were experimental features in the Forms core code itself, we are moving to the community toolkit for 5. And also there's a bunch of kind of community contributions there too. So, you know, for UWP, there's the Windows Community Toolkit. This is sort of the Xamarin version of that. But so let's talk about some new stuff that's coming up in 5. So shapes and paths, that feature's there today in 4.8. It is experimental, but it is there, and you can use it. And then in 5, it will become non-experimental. And so these are kind of the same shapes, XAML objects that you can use from UWP or WPF, but now you can use them from Xamarin. So things like line and ellipse, and paths. Paths are sort of the workhorse that lets you, draw all kinds of things. So you can embed those, straight in your XAML and have kind of cross-platform vector graphics doing it, with those primitives, just like you could in UWP and WPF and WinUI. And that also, of course, is handy for drawn UI, but it's also handy just for doing like kind of, vector icons or animations or anything where you want to have something a little more graphical. Okay, gradient brush is sort of continuing on the theme of drawing. So, brush support in general, some things that were colors before are now brushes in 4.8. And one of the fancier brushes is a gradient brush, which lets you do gradients. So you can fill shapes, any of the shapes in the previous slide, with a gradient brush. Again, same as UWP, WPF. Shell, so some more shell stuff is shell evolution in Forms 5. I'm not sure how much we're going to change there in 5. I don't think that there's going to be a lot that's changing, but some UWP support for shell is one thing that is coming with Forms 5. And so this is, a few of the controls in the toolkit, the community toolkit. And this is also kind of a placeholder slide just so you can have the URL to the Xamarin Community Toolkit and check out what else is there. And again, it's pretty new, so I expect to see a lot more stuff get added there. But there's a lot of activity. Okay, so kind of moving on to the Maui stuff and the One.Net sort of vision and more the kind of the Microsoft strategy around .NET. So there's a lot of focus internally and externally. So we want to move to just having one .NET. So kind of unification is sort of the theme of the work of the last couple of years and the next couple of years too in the roadmap. So so some of it is taking stuff from so one .NET that you can use anywhere, and sort of the next slide. So taking some things from Mono, .NET Core, .NET Framework, and putting them all together. So .NET 5 for the most part and .NET 6 for mobile should let you kind of build for all of these platforms on this slide, kind of across all platforms, and using technology that's so that came from there's some mono stuff that goes in there, and to a large degree is kind of making there be a consistent .NET experience, both in terms of kind of runtime APIs, sort of .NET Core, DM related APIs, standardizing those everywhere. The builds, so it's targeting just one version of .NET. So we'll talk about .NET Standard in its future here in a couple more slides, and having a more consistent story for Xamarin. All right, so so some of you probably saw the announcement a few weeks back from Emma Landreth about kind of the future of .NET Standard, and so I kind of touch on this here too. So today you can write a .NET Standard library that targets any of these platforms. Going forward, the idea is to sort of get rid of .NET Standard as a thing with its own name, and it just be .NET 5 or .NET 6. You target that, and it can work across all platforms. Getting rid of some of the complexities that a lot of them are just on the implementation side that go into kind of support for .NET Standard. So so kind of simplification there. And on the mobile side, Xamarin support, mobile support for this one.NET is preview version of the tooling is going to be available in .NET 5. So later this year, there's not that many months left of the year, but still before the end of the year, that's going to come out. And then .NET 6, so next November is when we kind of GA the fully integrated non-preview version of Xamarin that's on the same .NET as everything else, and also has more kind of build unification where the target framework moniker is the same as the same .NET 6 target framework. The projects work more like .NET Standard projects, where all the files are included by default. You don't have to kind of explicitly add every file that you want to include in the project. So kind of have that experience be consistent with everything, including Xamarin. Okay, so this slide is just sort of a general, .NET, woohoo. There's lots of things to love about the .NET ecosystem, and Xamarin can kind of draft off some of this support to be a great way to build mobile apps. All right, so the plan for Xamarin kind of going forward is to kind of do a couple things around one.NET. One is to be part of the use the .NET 6 runtime, .NET 6 projects. So that's kind of tooling stuff that's independent of forms. And then there's this forms evolution, which also ships at the same time, which we call .NET Maui. So multi-platform app UI is the origin of that term. And so it's it's basically Xamarin, but with more integrated as a core part of .NET, but still with kind of good backward compatibility. So it's more of a really an evolution of forms, not a new product per se. So here are some of the highlights. of Maui, and we've got kind of more slides on these. So single project, that's one of our kind of new features. So it's a simpler kind of experience. I'll show more of what that means. Better desktop support is another one. And like I said, targeting .NET 6, but preview that goes along with .NET 5. And okay, so here is kind of a chart that highlights some of the differences. So I'll just call out a couple things here in terms of improved desktop support. So Mac is new. So it's where is that? Yes. Shoot. Mac OS, coming from Microsoft now, so you can build kind of, better desktop support for cross-platform. And also, we have kind of UWP support today. We're moving to WinUI and kind of improved, desktop support in general for Windows, but targeting WinUI. And WPF, it sort of stays with. We still support WPF. It's community supported tooling, so not as much kind of energy from Microsoft folks that go into that, but it's still an option for folks who want to use it. So there's some re-architecting that's gone into renderers. I'll talk more about that. I mentioned single project, new feature. So multi-targeting kind of goes along with single project. Multi-window support, it's sort of an important feature, especially for desktop apps. So we're adding that in Maui. .NET CLI support is another new feature, and I have to stop clicking. And SDK style projects, that's what I mentioned before. So kind of the more consistent project experience where all files are included by default, and there's some other kind of differences. And the CS project is a lot more concise and a lot more kind of human friendly. That's coming for Xamarin 2 with these changes. Right. And so again, this is the timeline, preview later this year and release in November. So here is more about single project. So the idea of single project is that, so today, if you go and create a new Xamarin app in Visual Studio, you normally get 3 projects or maybe 4 if you choose to target Windows via UWP as well. So there's this shared project, the top one here, My App, and then there's what we call head projects for each of the platforms. So the project for Android, a project for iOS, and if you included UWP, there'd be a UWP project there too. So most of the code is shared. There's a little bit in the platform heads. Some startup code is there. Resources like images and fonts traditionally in Xamarin are done and are stored in the platform project because they're stored a little differently on the different platforms. And so, that's the current experience. It makes some sense conceptually, but it's a little more complicated. So for Maui, one of the things we want to do is simplify it to so there's just a single project, and the way that works is it uses multi-targeting, and here's some kind of screenshots that show what the new experience should be there. So again, just a single project in the solution. Here's what the target framework would look like, listing multiple. So the 3 target frameworks there indicate that it is using multi-targeting, so you can build it 3 ways, for Android, for iOS, or or just shared stuff. And so there's a few other kind of notable changes here. So resources like images and fonts, because they so we have to have better support for shared resources that work on all platforms. So you kind of define those in this kind of shared resources folder here. And if need be, you can create platform specific resources, but still in the shared project in platform dependent folders. So, and then the same applies to fonts as well. And then for your code, you can still create platform dependent code. You just do it in the way, in sort of the typical way it's done with multi-targeting, where the platform code is either in source files that have some kind of special naming convention, and then are sort of in this platform directory, or you can use if statements in the code, which is can be handy, but for the most part, creating separate source files for the different platforms is sort of the approach that we expect most people to take. And again, the tooling should have support for being able to see those in a user-friendly way from the single project. And also the single project experience, it means that we can have a somewhat more user-friendly experience in terms of picking which device to run on, where when you sort of change the device, that also changes what app type you're targeting. So you can switch between iPhone, Android, and Windows, essentially via this UI, the device picker UI. So that's the new UX we're kind of envisioning there.
Mic on.
Let's see.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't see a place for chat, so I figured I'd just raise my hand here.
Yeah, no problem.
Just curious, I'm more interested in desktop support, like for Windows and Mac OS, and I was just curious, and I'm expecting the answer to be no, but that's okay. Going forward, especially with the integration of the subsystem for Linux into the Windows, will there be a way to test Mac OS emulation?
So what do you want to do? Do you want to develop for Mac desktop?
Yeah,
Windows or from a Windows machine?
For both Windows and Mac OS or Linux, would I be able to, emulate that and test that without actually having a Mac?
Yeah. So I'll say a few things there. So Linux support, it is something folks sometimes ask for. We don't have any current plans to have Microsoft support there beyond sort of some community efforts. As for Mac, so yeah, like I mentioned in a previous slide, so Mac desktop support is coming from Microsoft, kind of first-class support there in Maui. However, for that, you would normally need to use a Mac in order to actually run the app and see it. So for desktop, you would need a Mac. If it's just iOS that you want to develop for, which is not what you said, but is what a lot of our customers want, that's when that hot restart feature can be handy, and you can do a lot of your iOS development just from Windows with Visual Studio and an iPhone or other iOS device plugged into your Windows PC. But for Mac desktop, yeah, you would still need a Mac, unfortunately. So yeah, that's any other questions there?
I figured I'd ask.
Yeah. No, it's a good question, of course. And then kind of the same for Mac users out there. If they want to develop for Windows desktop, they need to use Windows. At least that's currently what we're doing. So another thing that's new, and this sort of comes with integration and becoming more of a first-class member of the .NET ecosystem, is .NET CLI support. So, in Maui, you'll be able to use the .NET CLI to create a new project, as opposed to just going to, say, Visual Studio and doing file new project. This is something that folks sometimes like. It can be a little more efficient in some scenarios. It's especially handy for use with VS Code. So we're starting to do more with VS Code support, and this kind of plays hand in hand with using VS Code, using the CLI to go and create a new project for Xamarin, and then use, say, VS Code to go and make changes to it and develop with it. The VS Code story is still it's still kind of coming together fully, but we plan to do more there in the Maui timeframe. And speaking of VS Code, this was a demo from Build on MVU, which is kind of another new thing in Maui. I think it'll still be considered experimental when Maui first launches, but it's something that we think is maybe the right way to go going forward. I don't know. So there's so it's still something we're kind of getting customer feedback on. Coded UI versus XAML versus Blazor style. Our current sort of message is that all three are supported, and you can kind of pick your favorite. XAML is definitely supported, and MVU, coded UI, and mobile Blazor bindings are, I think they'll still be considered experimental in the Maui timeframe. But anyway, this was kind of a build demo of using, it'd be nice if this was animated, but it's not, of using VS Code with C#, MVU, model view update, coded UI, and hot reload. That's sort of a teaser. Okay, so next I thought I'd kind of go deeper into some of the architecture changes in Maui, and this is mostly relevant. So it's kind of interesting. It's mostly relevant to folks who implement custom renders. That's where the biggest API changes are coming. The rest of the API is, there's not really that much that's changing in terms of breaking backward compatibility. But before I go into that, I just want to pause. Any other questions? Or just holler if there are, and can interrupt me, or any other topics.
Yeah, I have a question. Like my background is mainly on WPF, and I have minimal work with Xamarin. I just want to know, moving forward with .NET 6, like will still we have WPF, or will just will be Maui, or how can I migrate my experience to .NET 6?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the current plans are that WPF support will continue in sort of the form that it is today, and that it's sort of kind of, I wish I knew what the official Microsoft language here is. It's kind of deprecated, but not really. So .NET Core supports WPF. There's kind of improved tooling support for WPF and .NET Core that's coming. There won't be very many kind of framework changes in WPF, but still kind of a nice go forward story for folks who have WPF desktop apps, in terms of continuing to be compatible with them. But not a lot of kind of new features coming on WPF. Then, WinUI is sort of the preferred way to build Windows native apps kind of going forward. So that's coming very shortly when UI3, and kind of taking over from UWP. And then there's Maui, which is a way to build cross-platform apps that can target multiple platforms, mobile and desktop. Probably still a little more mobile focused because just that's what Xamarin has done traditionally. And I think our desktop support is going to be better in Maui, but it's still a cross-platform framework that I can target mobile and desktop, but it's probably still kind of best for mobile. So that's the story. It's if it's not a great story, it's at least a good story, and it kind of it's the current story for in terms of kind of UI frameworks.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
No, I mean, I like where it's going. I would like to see a little bit more focus on desktop and maybe Linux, but I understand that's not also the where most people are going, where the money's at. So
yeah. So there's an experimental project at the end of this deck that might be more up the alley of what you're kind of interested in there. So sort of curious to get your feedback on that once we get to it. So, but first, wanted to go a little. Yeah, sure.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Sorry, Brad, we were discussing here about what is the process between migrating between native Xamarin to Maui, or native Xamarin to, Maui, basically. So how the process is going to be for current native projects, Xamarin native?
Yeah, gotcha. So Maui is a forms evolution. So our native story is the same, which is the same native APIs that exist today will exist in the future with .NET 6. We are, I think we're going to kind of rebrand them a bit so that they're like the .NET Android and iOS APIs, but they're really the same Xamarin APIs that exist today for native apps. And yeah, they'll continue to work just the same way they work today. There's in terms of where we're focused, there's less and less kind of investment going into native tooling and the native experience, but it's still supported. So I guess to answer your question more directly, you can choose to move your app to Maui pretty much the same that you would move your app to Forms if you wanted to, or you could just stick with native like it is today, and maybe use Forms or Maui for new apps that you build going forward. Yeah.
Just to clarify though, so if we have fairly large enterprise apps, it's not easy to get budget approval to rewrite in Maui. So if we're on 4.8, how long will that be supported? Or are you saying that we can upgrade to 5.0 Maui or 6.0, whatever it's called, and continue to use the 3 project structure of Xamarin 4OS and Android, and that'll continue to be upgradable without a rewrite?
So a couple things there. We should be backward compatible with 3 projects, and even so that should still work. And also for the rest of the app, and even if you did kind of want to move to the single project structure, the bulk of the app itself, shouldn't need to change. It's still the same, for the most part, the same APIs with Maui. So our plan sort of started out being a little bit more ambitious, a little bit more of a revolution than an evolution. But in the last kind of few months, it's become, more and more of an evolution with less and less kind of breaking changes. That's sort of the theme that we've been under. So it's probably correct to kind of think largely think of Maui as like Xamarin Forms 6.
Okay.
So,
thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Sergey, did you have another question?
Yeah, it's a quick question. Does Maui in .NET 5, since it's a preview, does it come with Go Live license or no?
So, I mean, you're not really supposed to use apps built with it to go live. However, there's no, so that's not kind of recommended or supported. On the other hand, there's no sort of licensing restrictions there. I mean, I think if you actually did that, say for like a beta app or something that got little distribution, then you'd certainly, it'd be legit from Microsoft licensing perspective, as long as it kind of works technically.
Thanks.
No problem. All right. Anything else before moving on? All right. So this kind of goes a little deeper into some of the code changes in Maui. So this is sort of an it's kind of an overview slide. I won't read through this either, but several of the kind of goals in terms of cleaning up the code, making some improvements, but still being highly backward compatible. Sort of the main theme of this slide. But I'll touch on some of those things as I kind of go through. Okay, so the biggest sort of change that's customer facing, but it's only customer facing if you build custom renders, it is the way the renderers work. But still, it's one of the bigger changes in Maui, and that's lots of kind of design and implementation work is going on now around that, so it's kind of interesting. So this is the way that renderers work today. There's a kind of a couple things to point out here. So one is that the button renderer, this is this is a custom renderer for buttons. Or it could be a renderer that's built into the Forms platform. Either way, they both work the same way. So it declaratively says that it is a renderer for a Xamarin Forms button. So button renderer is a platform-specific thing. Xamarin Forms button is the cross-platform thing that most of the cross-platform code uses. And the way it declares that is with this assembly attribute, export renderer, which kind of declares the pairing of the platform, cross-platform type to the platform-specific renderer. So a couple things here. One is using the assembly attributes is slow. It makes the apps start up more slowly because we need to kind of look at each assembly, look at all the assembly attributes that are defined in that assembly, and there usually aren't a lot, but just the act of kind of looking for these attributes in the metadata for all assemblies adds, I wish I knew the exact time, but it's I think a few hundred milliseconds to app startup. So it's a non-trivial amount of time, and we want to make apps start as quickly as possible. So there's a performance hit there doing it that way. So we're moving away from the assembly attributes in Maui. And the other thing that's kind of worth pointing out here is that in the current scheme, the button renderer points to the Xamarin Forms button, but the Forms button doesn't really have any easy, convenient way to get back to the native thing. So that has some implications for how some other code is written. It can make it a little more complicated. So that's another thing that's changing in Maui. Yeah, so that's what I just said. So there are those goals around renderers, and also there's this desire to be able to make the forms architecture a little bit lighter weight and a little more flexible in terms of supporting, especially kind of these newer app development styles. They're experimental, but we want to kind of have support for them and have framework that can efficiently kind of support them. So that means that so for a button, we want to be able to have kind of a traditional Xamarin Forms button that's in XAML, a comment button. So comment is the kind of the name of our MVU technology, model view update. It's sort of a way to a more modern way to write apps that's similar to the way Elm does it and Fabulous does it, where you and a little bit more similar to how Flutter and Dart works, where anyway you kind of write your UI in code and the state is immutable, and there's not kind of bindings. Well, there's in our current implementation there are some bindings, but for the most part there's not as much in terms of kind of XAML bindings per se. So some of the XAML stuff goes away, but we want to kind of keep the core of button functionality, including the button handler, which is what ends up actually doing the platform specific stuff around buttons. And so maybe there's a couple other button types as well. So anyway, the kind of the TLDR of that is that kind of breaking the button apart so that there's kind of this full class Xamarin Forms button that does all the stuff that's buttons do today, and there's sort of this separate lighter weight interface iButton, and for the non-XAML kind of flavors of buttons, this is the only thing that they have to kind of know about is the iButton. And the renderers also are sort of associated with the interface, not with the full object. So interfaces are a new thing. For the most part, if a lot of XAML kind of traditional forms developers won't need to kind of do anything with them, but they're there. And if you do custom renders or like use the MVU stuff, then these interfaces you'll start to see them. Okay, so in terms of getting rid of assembly attributes, the replacement there is to just call a register API. So if you create custom renders, no more assembly attribute, but instead you'll want to call register at app startup time for all the custom renderers, and that's the thing that makes the association between the cross-platform Xamarin Forms label, in this example, and the handler that does the rendering for it. Okay, so no more assembly scanning, and let's see, okay, so another part of the custom render kind of experience that's changed is that the there's another slide that shows this a little better, but you can now define sort of the mapping from cross-platform properties to platform-specific properties in a little bit more functional way through one of these mapper objects. So basically, for each property that you want to support for your custom render, you add it in the view mapper, and then call the right code on the platform specific side in order to apply changes to it, as opposed to the old way, which used on element change and a big if statement. Let's see. So yeah, okay. So I can show a little bit more about that. So so again, Maui's not a complete rewrite. It's not, the changes for the most part are, backward compatible. However, the render stuff has changed, like shown here. So, but the controls themselves should be the same to the consumer. So here's the new interfaces, like I mentioned before. Here's the kind of a new style custom renderer, which needs to implement iViewHandler now. It's a little bit more about this change. Let's see. Oh no, this is the kind of the old way. So iVisualElement renderer is the kind of the core functionality that's used today in order to go and hook stuff up to custom renders, but that's replaced by iViewHandler in Maui. So for the most part, it's the same kind of stuff conceptually. The mapping is fairly straightforward, but some things are different, like, for example, the element property change. The event handlers have gone away. The property handling is different. It now uses these kind of mappers. You don't need to hook up to the events. What is this? So yes, update value is kind of now used to propagate property changes. But for the most part, it's the kind of the same functionality you need to provide for custom renders. It's just you just provide it with some slightly different APIs. So here's in Maui, there's iView is kind of the generic cross-platform interface that's for all controls. Excuse me. And iViewHandler is what the handlers, either custom handlers or first-party handlers that we kind of implement in the Forms core code itself, implement, and they kind of map to point to each other. Oh, so a view now points directly to the handler. So before I said that there's no reference from the cross-platform thing to the platform-specific renderer, which was kind of a pain, but now there is through this handler property. And there's an example where that's used here in another slide. Okay, so here's the old style kind of big if statement, where generally for all the properties that you want to kind of support and map, you would generally have code like this that does it. And now it is done with these mappers. This isn't, it'd be good to kind of show more of it, but hopefully you're going to get the idea from the slide. With these property mappers that defined functions that indicate the particular action that should be taken when that property changes. So, and let's see. And so something else we're kind of doing is adding these extension classes, which provide sort of a handy way to be able to call APIs against a particular handler and do it either from the forms infrastructure code itself or from app code if you're doing kind of more advanced things. So yeah. So mappers, extension APIs, slightly different APIs for defining the handler itself, and having a reference from the cross-plat thing to the platform-specific handler. Those are kind of the highlights of the changes on the custom renderer side. So hopefully that made sense, or at least kind of gave you a flavor of the changes there on the rendering side. So here, this is another slide that kind of goes through some of the other changes in Maui with a little bit more implementation detail around them. So I'll sort of share more in a couple subsequent slides. So, but this sort of emphasizes some of the general themes with Maui 2, which I think is good. So, it's about simplifying things. So single project is kind of simplifying things from the end user perspective. And also we want to kind of simplify some of the kind of the core code, especially for supporting these new types of ways to author your UI, like with MVU code, where there's kind of a lighter weight set of stuff on the form side that you need to use, or gets called under the covers for MVU, and you don't need, some of the Xaml support kind of code kind of goes away and is as sort of architected out for those scenarios. So single project I mentioned, .NET 6, all being part of kind of a good .NET 6 citizen. New UI paradigms, that's MVU and mobile laser bindings. Control templates are kind of another interesting thing. So there's a slide on those here in a bit. And yeah, so some more shell improvements. So, more focused on, shell being kind of the easy default way to do kind of the overall implementation of your app, and in some cases remove some of the needs for an MVVM framework as it kind of, it's kind of going in that direction, taking on a little more stuff from that some of the other frameworks offer today. So, but first, control templates. So this is, if you're kind of familiar with WPF or UWP, as probably most of you are, this is sort of the same kind of templates that you know and love, perhaps. At least a lot of folks do. In WPF and UWP land, brought to forms XAML. So kind of a way to create controls with, often, it doesn't have to be, but often using drawn UI, coupled with visual states, coupled with this notion of kind of a default template, so you can have lookless controls, and the control consumer can customize the look of the control in arbitrary ways by supplying their own template if they so choose. But there's kind of a default template that comes out of the box. So kind of moving more to, at least for some controls, to the UWP and WPF model there. So so kind of the best way to think about it is for like Android and iOS, instead of wrapping a native button, if there's a drawn button with a template, then the template sort of provides the exact look of the button in different visual states, and then the consumer of the button control can customize that look if they so choose. So I think we'll see more and more kind of drawn UI controls living side by side with native wrap controls. And so this repo is there's a bunch of template-based controls here, as Javier, who's one of the forums team developers, is kind of exploring do this template concept and doing more and more stuff with template UI. So I think that these might all move to the Xamarin Community Toolkit, but they're kind of at the separate repo today if you want to check them out, or even perhaps provide your own contributions to the to those set of controls or to the toolkit. What else? Oh, so dependency injection. We're looking to move to Microsoft Extensions hosting for doing dependency injection. So that's another kind of architecture changes. And another kind of, doing some stuff that MVVM frameworks do, and kind of doing that in the forms Maui kind of core. So I don't know all the details here, but apparently Xamarin layouts sometimes aren't quite deterministic and sometimes provide somewhat surprising results, where if you set a minimum or a max, like a min with min height or max with max height, that they aren't always 100% enforced. So we're looking at kind of cleaning that up some to improve the layout behavior, so it behaves more like what users expect, but not break. So that probably means that a little bit of backward compatibility will be broken in terms of exactly how something is laid out, but hopefully not much. And I think that we may actually end up doing that by having kind of new layouts that replace the old ones, so you can kind of get 100% backward compatibility, or you can use the new thing with like stack layout v2 going forward and new apps to get new behavior and a little bit better on like MPU support. Single project, I've talked about this before. So a lot of this is tracked in the Maui repo. And so this slide was intended to be mostly kind of a pointer to where all this work is happening. I'll just bring that up here. Zoom in. Hopefully this is somewhat readable. So the Maui repo, we actually kind of did some earlier work in terms of code in this repo, and then about a month and a half ago kind of blew away that previous stuff and moved the current forms code over and have started evolving it. So that kind of mirrors this mindset of being more evolutionary and a little less revolutionary. So if you want to kind of check out the code in the repo, kind of FYI on that. The other interesting thing here, probably the more interesting one, is these issues and discussion items.
Brett, you're not sharing your screen.
Oh yeah, yes,
Mic
of course.
on.
Yeah. So. Okay, so it's coming through now, right? So sharing the whole screen, and I'll
Mic
go back.
off.
Well, I'll just continue sharing the whole screen for the remainder. So so here is it where all the Maui work is happening. .NET/Maui. The code itself is a little bit interesting, but the issues and discussions are kind of perhaps the most interesting things in terms of the design. Some of the features is going to nail them down, and discussion around those. So trying to we try to do as much stuff in a kind of an open way, in a community engaged way as we can. Okay. Oh, this was just a cute slide of Shane's cat with a Surface Duo, which I thought I'd borrow when I borrowed the rest of Shane's slides. So that's that. And then this is kind of an experimental side project thing, which I wanted to close with. But before I go there, any kind of questions, comments about the custom renderers or any of those kind of previous slides that are more on the architecture side or anything really?
Mic on.
I want to know how Maui will be different from Ono platform. I know Ono platform is not Microsoft's thing, but like I attended the conference a month ago, and it looks like it backed my Microsoft as well.
Yeah. So I will say from my perspective, the more folks in the .NET ecosystem, the better. And Uno is certainly one of those participants. The Uno model is to kind of align with UWP and WinUI and provide that object model that you can use for mobile, for Windows 7, and for web, as well as kind of for desktop apps. So how is Forms Maui kind of different? It frankly kind of plays in some of the same spaces and is, I don't know, it's to some degree it's a complementary thing. To some degree it can be viewed as a bit of a competitive thing. But again, from my perspective, it's the more the better in terms of participants in the .NET ecosystem. So yeah, hopefully that's probably the best answer I can get on that. Okay. Any other questions or follow-ups? All right. So the Uno is probably a good segue into this last few slides, which is, so this is just to be clear on the positioning. This is an experimental thing. It's kind of it's a side project from me, but that I'm kind of spearheading, but also getting some feedback from folks in the community, getting a little more feedback internally, and trying to kind of evangelize around, as well as helping to kind of flesh out, which I call .NET standard UI. So let me kind of introduce that, and then we'll kind of get your thoughts on it if anyone has any thoughts to share. So anyway, so this is, as we were saying, this is kind of the reality that exists today. There are multiple XAML UI frameworks out there that they're all fairly similar, but somewhat different. So WPF is still the most widely used today. UWP and now WinUI, kind of the present and the future for Windows desktop. The Fluent UI especially is kind of focused on those technologies in terms of kind of new UI experience, and kind of more of most of the current Microsoft effort on the SDK side is going on there for the Windows platform. Forms and Maui, excuse me, again, what we just been talking about, Uno, another kind of community player, but they're doing some cool stuff with web UIs. They added some more kind of Skia drawn UI support recently, and what else do they do? Now I forgot what else they announced recently, but it's there's definitely some inertia there, and kind of I think good momentum on the Uno side. Avalonia is another community effort around. So Uno is UWP and WinUI, bringing that model, to more platforms. Avalonia is a community effort around bringing WPF to more platforms, especially desktop platforms like Mac, Linux, and they're starting to do some mobile stuff there for Avalonia. So, a bunch of different players out there. Arguably, they all bring value to .NET. And, I like to think of it as an ecosystem. You call it the .NET UI ecosystem. So, but all part of, this .NET family. So, that's kind of the reality as it exists today, and probably as it'll exist going forward. You might imagine it'd be best if there was one UI stack to rule them all, but that's sort of not, things aren't kind of currently going in that direction. And even if they would, it would still be kind of a big shift for everyone to move to some new thing, whereas arguably better to have sort of a more of an incremental transition approach if we do want to modernize some of this. So a bunch of XAML UI stacks out there, and in particular, you're not really able today to write kind of shared code, especially UI controls, which I think this is where it's kind of the most useful, that runs on all of these stacks. They're all, if you want to have a kind of a control like a chart control or a fancy gauge control, it's kind of a simple control or a real fancy one. Either way, you could implement a bunch of kind of cross-platform code, but you still have to kind of put a front end on all of them, which kind of maps to the different UI frameworks in question. Again, all pretty similar, but slightly different. It also makes it a little harder to write shared tooling because these different flavors out there, so it's fragmented. But so how can we make it less fragmented, but still not have some kind of big shift that would be a little kind of infeasible and maybe destabilizing to the community? So .NET Standard UI is kind of a proposed answer to do that. And I've got to kind of talk through more about what that is and how that works in detail in just a few slides. So here the idea is that, for all these, XAML frameworks out there, they're all, fairly similar, but some differences. So let's pick a subset of APIs. And by APIs, I primarily mean kind of XAML objects that traditionally go in a .xaml file. Pick a subset, sufficient at least for creating custom controls with drawn UI. Quote unquote standardize those which really just means create quote unquote standard versions in the system in some new namespace, system standard UI, but follow the same kind of base it as much as possible on the UWP and WinUI object model, because that's what a lot of folks kind of view as the de facto standard. Even forms folks often say that, well, why don't you follow more UWP and WPF naming conventions? So kind of define that flavor as the standard, stick it in a single namespace, and use interfaces instead of classes for some of the same reasons that Maui uses interfaces, but mostly it's kind of implementation reasons, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So, standardize a subset of the APIs, and then support those APIs via wrappers on, across multiple UI frameworks, like all of those. So that will let you do things like write controls, especially controls that use drawn UI, and as long as you just stick to the standard UI APIs, you can write a control in a single .NET standard assembly, or .NET 5, .NET 6 going forward, but a single assembly that's traditionally .NET standard that can work in all supported UI frameworks with binary compatibility. So it isn't just kind of standard naming conventions. It's also write once, run anywhere kind of code where it's binary compatibility. So this is more of a, so it's mostly for control authors, but apps, for app builders, you can use kind of a mixture of these standard APIs or the existing platform APIs as you implement your app. So to kind of partially to be able to gradually move to using new APIs while still having kind of 100% backward compatibility and no the ability to kind of mix and match as you please, and no kind of big big platform swap where you have to like rewrite your app to use something new. So here's a little bit more on that in terms of kind of the app model. So again, the idea is that if you're creating, say, a WPF app, you can kind of do it the traditional way, but you could also use, say, some standard UI controls and use those controls in much the same way you'd use, regular WPF controls, but they're just controls that work across more, a broader ecosystem. So, more UI frameworks. So hopefully kind of a bigger set of controls out there. And then, so this is a lot about controls, but it also allows, us kind of Microsoft first parties and some third parties too, to create more and more kind of shared code that works across UI frameworks. SVG support is kind of an example of that. Any kind of tooling stuff. Or kind of shared framework stuff. So, SVG, there's a bunch of parsing that you kind of have to map the SVG primitives to the kind of the right thing on the Microsoft side, but that all can be kind of cross-platform, cross-UI frameworks if you have like drawing primitives to draw all that stuff. And so here is the full set of kind of the current APIs around it. So again, so kind of the core set of drawing. So you can, you create controls or, well, anything with the same kind of shapes primitives, the same kind of geometry objects that let you specify clipping or, stroke paths or do transforms that kind of using conjunction with the shapes, brushes and strokes to kind of, all kind of drawing related stuff. Some kind of, so that's kind of, most of it's around kind of shared drawing. Some kind of, text is another kind of core component that you need to be able to draw as well and do the styling. And so here is kind of the text objects that are there today. Border, I just added this yesterday, actually, because it's all drawn. It's sort of it's another kind of good candidate for standardizing. And then some of the core, and so kind of the core layout types, grid, stack panel, canvas, and then some core kind of infrastructure types for manipulating kind of UI elements and controls and doing it in kind of a standard way. And let's see. And what else to kind of highlight here? And then the other kind of interesting thing about this approach is that the rendering itself is sort of pluggable, where it can either kind of get rendered via Skia or via platform native APIs, but these kind of these same shapes primitives map in a cross-platform way to the rendering, so that you kind of don't have to worry about that from an implementation perspective. But it is kind of, Skia is kind of sort of a nice way to get some nicer, higher performing in some scenarios, hardware accelerated in some scenarios, most scenarios, rendering support that's done cross-platform. So yeah, so that's sort of it for the slides about that. And then kind of the two kind of questions that I have, well, I suppose I'll add a third question first, which is, did that all make sense? I'm still kind of, I need to kind of perfect my elevator pitch for that. So feel free to give me feedback on that. And would this be useful to you? This kind of thing. What are your thoughts? Would it be useful? And if so, specifically, what would be kind of most useful here in terms of what kind of problems do you have today where some technology like this would be a useful thing to have, and that would also be kind of good feedback for me to have and to help kind of build the case around this. So yeah, so let me kind of get questions, thoughts around that, and also around anything else. And so we'll just do, I guess, Q&A for the rest of the session. And also, feel free to reach out at any time with any kind of, questions, feedback, anything, Xamarin related, anything else. Email is probably kind of the best way to reach me officially at Microsoft, or if you want to, book a call for some reason to, talk about stuff, you can use this link for that, which is kind of a good way to book something against my calendar. So, you can pick the time that works best for you from my kind of available slots. Okay, so yeah. So first, the standard UI stuff, does that kind of, make sense? Did I explain that reasonably well enough? And any thoughts about that? And any thoughts about anything else for that matter? So opening it up. Surely somebody has something.
I guess I have a question here, like regarding the side project you are talking about. Is this a part of the project unification by Microsoft or something different?
Say again. Did you say Project Reunion?
Or yes, sorry, Reunion. Yeah.
It's something different. I mean, it's in something of the same spirit as Reunion. Reunion's kind of about broader platform support for Windows. It's strictly a Windows thing, and my thing is kind of taking, I don't know, some of those same concepts, the same desires, across more platforms and kind of UI frameworks.
So to answer your question, I think this will be useful because, as I said, we have multiple flavors from Xaml, and although they're very close, like I find it's hard, for example, to move from WPF to Xamarin because suddenly instead of having a stack, now I have VStack or something. So these kinds of changes, if we can have one standard Xaml, this would be very useful.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that feedback. So yeah, it's sort of inspired by XAML standard, kind of the earlier attempt to kind of have some naming standardization, but in some ways going further to have a binary standard, but also by limiting to a slightly smaller set of APIs, it's a little more tractable. But yeah, that's certainly one of the goals, or at least my goal is to have more standardization on the names, so it's conceptually simpler, as well as being able to write code that works against a wider variety of UI frameworks. Any other thoughts, questions?
Hey, Brett, not to put you on the spot.
Sure.
Why are so many Microsoft apps made with React Native and not Xamarin?
So, I mean, we like to say, and this is true, that, all the Microsoft, product teams can kind of choose the technology that they think will work best for them. So that's one of the reasons, just kind of that philosophy. As far as like, teams and some of, which is created from, some of the folks that did Skype stuff before. I know some of their motivation was around kind of web support. They really wanted to, to be able to kind of share UI between web and the desktop or mobile, and React Native was React, and with React Native it was kind of a better choice for that. So that was one of the things that kind of pushed them. And I mean, I guess frankly, some of it's Microsoft being a big company, and everyone is not always 100% aligned on every strategic initiative, but that's okay. It's a little more ecumenical, and and there's pros and cons of that, but there's some pros. So that's I don't know. That's probably the best answer I can give.
Yeah.
Anything else? Anyone? All right. So again, feel free to reach out anytime if you want.